For most of us guitar players on our pedal boards, most of us are not brave enough to play without reverb. It's an effect that seems to just add a little bit of pad and cushion to whatever it is that you're doing to kind of help insulate your playing to a certain degree, and is likely one of the top 5, if not top 10, most used effects on any given pedal board. However, the trend in reverbs over the last 10 years is to go super feature laden, having reverb multi-effects that can do seemingly 10 or 12 different reverb styles and can have 128 presets by way of MIDI. However, when we think of reverb tones that are on the most iconic records where we hear a pairing of either a studio reverb or some sort of pedal-based or amp-based reverb paired with a guitar, it's pretty limited to very few styles of reverb. For the most part, we're talking about plate reverbs, spring reverbs, hall reverbs, and maybe room reverbs in some cases. But we're not seeing tons of different modulated and reverse reverbs for the most part when we're talking about, again, hit iconic records that we know of and love that pair guitar with reverb. So today what I want to talk about is a pedal that I consider to be the best digital reverb ever made, and I have no idea why Digitech decided to discontinue this reverb. It is so amazing sounding. Now, before we get further into this video about the RV-7 reverb, I just wanted to quickly mention that only about 20% of you that are watching every week are actually subscribed to the channel. So now would be a great time to, one, verify that you are actually subscribed. Many of you believe you are, but actually are not. Or if you're not subscribed, please do subscribe, hit the bell icon so that you can be updated with all the great content that we're coming out just like this every single week. All right, so now back to the reverb. Now, historically, as I've said, over the last 10 years with reverb pedals, the trend has been to go crazy with MIDI-controlled reverbs and having tons of presets. And I wouldn't say it's until the last year or so where we've seen any sort of heavy-hitting reverb come out that doesn't include a lot of those preset options, that being the UA Golden Reverb is sort of the first that I've seen that's had a lot of traction in the marketplace that hasn't utilized this. But the RV-7 wasn't particularly popular even in its heyday. A lot of people thought that the enclosures looked ugly, which I don't disagree with. They aren't particularly attractive. And also the name brand Digitech didn't conjure boutique vibes from anybody who was hearing the name. And again, pairing that with sort of the clunky, sort of militaristic look of the pedal, I don't think it helped contribute getting sales in the door. And ultimately, this whole line of hardwire pedals was shortly discontinued not too long after it came out. But one thing that differentiated this reverb from a lot of others that have ever come out is that it has a Lexicon chip inside of it. And when we think of the classic digital reverb sounds throughout history, Lexicon is the high watermark for all digital reverbs. And a lot of their classic algorithms were adapted in order to make the RV-7 possible. So when we're thinking of all those PCM series Lexicon reverbs that all the studio greats used and also many producers and engineers used on many hit records, it all comes back to Lexicon. And I think that there are 4 key sounds in the RV-7 which very closely represent the very best of the PCM era digital reverbs, and I think makes it one of the best reverb pedals ever made. The 4 different sounds that we're going to be going through today are a plate reverb, a room reverb, a hall reverb, and a spring reverb. I'm going to play some songs that would be indicative of those types of sounds so you get a sense of what this might do and how you might incorporate this into your rig. And I can tell you straight off that if you're into crazy modulated reverse reverbs or any of the perversions of reverb that people are into, you're not going to like this. But if you want great reverb sounds that are reminiscent of what you would find in a studio in the way that we know classic reverb sounds were paired with guitars on hit records, this is going to be a great reverb for you. This pedal is uncomplicated. It has 1 selector knob for the type of reverb and then 3 controls to change the reverb decay, the liveliness, and the overall mix level. So let's get into it and let's hear some examples of how this sounds in context, and again, why you might want to grab one of these and put it into your rig. So for today's examples, I'm going to be using my PRS 513. I'm going to be using it in a combination of both single coil and humbucking modes on the actual guitar itself. And for all the examples today, we're going to be running the RV-7 in stereo after the line out from the Dr. Special amplifier. The Dr. Special is a clean version of a steel string singer that has some of my mods and tweaks and really made to my taste in order to have what I consider to be the ultimate clean amplifier platform to stack other pedals into. You might also hear a little chorus from a Boss Wazacraft DC2W, and we don't have any delay going on any of this to really highlight what the reverb does and not distract from the overall tone. On some of the higher gain examples, you'll hear me use the Vertex dynamic distortion to kind of get some of that more 80s level gain distortion and grit. So let's start first with a room reverb. Now, typically, room reverb is simulating the sound of different rooms or even sometimes cathedrals. And some different sorts of Lexicon reverbs would have different sized rooms that you could simulate. And on this particular pedal, you have a fixed size room, but I would say that it just sounds really great and natural. And what I like to do with this particular setting is sort of create a little bit more air and space between the microphone, just sort of simulate what would happen if you were recording, say, like in the time of Led Zeppelin. So I'm going to play a little Led Zeppelin piece here, and you're going to get to hear what the room reverb does. Now I'm going to be playing with a little bit of gain from the dynamic distortion here, and so it is going to add a little bit more beef and harmonic content to the overall sound. But I think what you're going to hear is the widening aspect of what the room reverb does and really makes it sound as though there's a little bit more space between the mic and the speaker. In this particular case, I'm using a vintage 30 that's mic'd with an SM7B, and it's close mic'd. It's going to give you that breathy sound, that little extra amount of space, and again, really put you right next to the amp. Let's hear what that sounds like. So there was a little example of kind of an immigrant song played by a a less than stellar version of a Jimmy Page, but I think you get the idea here of how fat that sounded. Again, everything dry that's going in the amplifiers in mono, only the reverb is in stereo after the line out box. It's running it in a wet, dry, wet context. But you get to hear how big that room reverb just makes everything and just adds that extra space so that it almost kind of simulates in a way a really short delay, but it just stays out of the way a little bit better. It doesn't sound too overbearing, but it makes the guitar sound a heck of a lot fatter and just gives that distortion also just a little bit more room to sort of permeate and decay and really get that natural harmonic saturation. The next setting I want to go to is a plate reverb. And I think one of the most classic versions of a plate reverb in the context of recorded guitar has to unquestionably be Van Halen. And although I don't play like Van Halen at all, a lot of the classic studio musicians were trying to emulate a lot of the Van Halen tones. And one guy that I can think of in particular that really tried to go after a lot of that or was asked to kind of recall Van Halen type tones a lot were guys like Dan Huff. And on a lot of the songs that I hear Dan Huff play on, you can clearly hear that he's trying to kind of invoke some of the vibes of Eddie Van Halen. And in this example, I wanted to kind of invoke some of the Van Halen vibes a la Dan Huff in the band that he was in the 80s and 90s called Giant to kind of get some of those vibes. Again, I'm going to be using the dynamic distortion in this. I'm going to be using a little bit of chorus from the DC2W, and you're going to get to hear sort of that plate sound. It almost, again, makes the note just kind of just a little bit bigger, a little bloomier, and has the really classic essence of what we consider to be a classic plate reverb sound like you would have heard on the early Van Halen records. And I just love what it does. I don't miss having delay on this. It just sounds so big, and it gives me enough time to really get between different chords and different notes and feel like I have some of that carryover and that spillover from the reverb that just kind of helps make all the notes feel a little bit wider, a little fatter, and that gives me a little bit more time to feel like I'm making transitions between notes and chords so that everything really stays together and stays cohesive when I'm having kind of a chunkier, dirty rhythm sound. So let's check that out. Play a little kind of Dan Huff-esque, inspired by the classic Eddie Van Halen tones using that plate reverb. So I think that sounded really great. Plate reverb, again, I think is really great for hard rock music. Certainly heavier stuff, it can sound really good in. It stays out of the way, and a lot of times you don't even want delay on that because it just muddies up the mix a little too much. This just seems to really fit perfectly, especially when you're playing kind of higher gain chords and things like that. I really love what this does. Again, it's a great alternative to using a little bit more of a delay sound. This can kind of help keep things out of the way, keeps it a little bit more manageable under your fingers as you're, transitioning between chords. But let's now go to a hall reverb. And this is a really great sound on the RV-7, probably one of my most used sounds, especially for clean tones. And what I'm going to do is kind of play a little something that has a lot of space. I kind of have been listening a lot to 80s era Lionel Richie. And so I was going to play kind of like a little interpretation of Penny Lover and just kind of create some space with some of these chords, use a little bit of the tremolo bar, and maybe do a little bit of volume swells so we can hear what that does. And if I set the hall where I have the decay pretty long and the mix a little bit further down, I can get almost like a delay type sound out of it, and it really hangs in there and sounds great for clean tones. And so I'm just going to be using the guitar, the reverb, and I'm just going to set a slight modulation on the DC2W, and I'm really just going to be working the volume pedal and the whammy bar to kind of help swell some of those chords in, and you're just going to hear the beauty of that reverb. Just sounds so natural and so lush, and really, really fits a clean tone perfectly. This is one of my favorite settings for any sort of clean pads. Let's check it out. So again, a little bit of Penny Lover, of course, not as good as the original guitar player that would have been on a lot of the Lionel Richie tracks. That was Carlos Rios was the guy that was pretty much on most of those. Of course, you hear some Steve Lukather in some of them as well, like Running with the Night on the solos. But just a great sound, great clean tone, and I just love what that hall reverb does. And again, setting that decay kind of on the better side of 50%, you just get that nice long kind of decay where you get sort of almost again like a delay type quality, stays out of the way, but also allows me to just kind of swell in and get plenty of room to be able to work with and have plenty of space for that clean tone where I can just have those notes trail out. It sounds really, really beautiful. So let's now move to the spring reverb. And I think that this is one that is really hard to do. And even some of the Lexicon PCM era stuff didn't do it as well as the classic reverb tanks. And a lot of the Lexicon engineers went to Bricasti, and the Bricasti has a really great spring reverb. And I wouldn't say that this sounds quite as good as a Bricasti, but I think it is a very good and convincing spring reverb sound. And I'm comparing this to things like the 63 reverb that Fender collaborated with Boss on, which I think is one of the best sounding digital reverbs out there for spring. And it has very much a lot of those same elements, and I think certainly convincing, even if you're comparing it against something like a Strymon Flint or something like that. Sounds absolutely great. Again, I'm not going to put it on the same level as a Bricasti, but I am going to put it on what I think would be an equal level to the very best of digital reverbs in a pedal format. So I'm going to do a little bit of sort of a 60s kind of stack style, kind of Memphis sound, like a Steve Cropper-ish sort of thing. And originally I was thinking I would do something like Olivia from John Mayer, which is definitely a spring reverb sound. But when I was playing it, I was like, this sounds a lot more like Sam and Dave to me. And a lot of those classic Sam and Dave and Steve Cropper licks were using, classic Fender amps or Fender reverb tanks. So I think it actually is a little bit better use of it to kind of talk about kind of classic versions of spring reverb in the context of classic records like Sam and Dave and the work that they did at Stax Records. So let's hear a little bit of that. I'm going to have it on the spring setting, and I'm going to kind of leave everything right around 50%, and it just sounds really great. So let's try a little Soothe Me by Sam and Dave, and I'll do the best that I can to break out my Steve Cropper style licks. Let's see how it sounds. So that was Soothe Me again, a poor man's version of it. Of course, the incomparable Steve Cropper is absolutely amazing. I've actually heard some guys do some really cool interpretations of it, including Josh Smith, who has a kind of like a lesson video that I think he did with TC Electronics or something like that for some sort of clinic. And he goes through some of these licks as well, and they sound absolutely great. And so I thought, this would be a great way to showcase the early Spring Reverb sounds, to actually use an album that most likely had an original Spring Reverb tank in the amplifier, or separate from the amplifier if it was the kind of standalone versions. And this pedal does a really great job at that as well. So in summary, the RV-7, I think, undoubtedly is one of the best, most natural pedal-based digital reverbs ever made. It has the Lexicon chip, which is, again, the high watermark when it comes to digital reverbs, no matter who you talk to. I think it does a great job of recreating all the classic studio reverbs, as well as spring reverbs, whether we're talking about plate, hall, or room sounds. It's absolutely amazing, very natural, and you don't need 128 MIDI presets to get great reverb tones. If you don't need MIDI, this is probably the best way to go. Now, if you can't find an RV-7 because they are discontinued, you could check out something like the Digitech Polera, which is a very similar pedal. The algorithms are very similar to what's in the RV-7. There's also a version of the RV-7 called the Supernatural, which again is very similar to what you heard here. All of those are great reverbs, and are available at most of the places where you can find used gear, whether that be Reverb, whether that be Craigslist or eBay. I would look there for any one of these reverbs. If you can find one, they are absolute keepers and really excellent sounding. And these are cut above the rest. If you can get away with these reverb sounds and you don't need any specialty sort of weirdo reverbs that go, inverted, reverse, upside down, I need 128 presets, this won't be the right one. But if you want core tones that are amazing and great, nothing's going to do it better than this. So that was, again, the RV-7 Reverb, my favorite reverb out there when it comes to digital reverbs and pedal formats. I hope you dug this video. I welcome you to like, subscribe, leave us a comment. Tell me what your favorite example was that I played, or other great pedal-based reverbs that are not overly complicated. Again, you don't necessarily need to have MIDI to have a great sounding reverb, and I think that this pedal clearly proves that in the demonstrations that we gave today. If you like the video and you want to support us further, there's some great ways to do it. One way is you could buy one of our pedals from one of our authorized dealers. Today, for the Van Halen examples and for kind of the Led Zeppelin examples, I use the Dynamic Distortion. It's a great pedal if you want some higher gain tones and you want something that's really interactive with your volume control of the guitar. Definitely check that out if you're interested. Another way that you can support us is by going over to therigdr.com, where we sell all the cables that we use today to connect all the pedals, to connect the guitar to the amplifier, all the wet, dry, wet components of the cables. Those are all available over on therigdr.com, as well as private consulting. If you want some tips or some troubleshooting help with your rig individually, I can offer that over on therigdr.com through our private consultations. Also, if you want a free way to engage with us, go and check out our podcast over on Apple, Spotify, or any of the places that you get podcasts. We do a weekly roundtable with me from Vertex, Grant from Goodwood Audio, and Brian O'Million from O'Million Audio. We have a roundtable discussion every week about pedals, pedal boards, and tone. So definitely check that out if you're interested in having a longer form discussion of similar topics that we talk about right here on the channel. Until next time, I'm Mason Marangella from Vertex Effects, aka The Rig Doctor. See you later.